The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and approaching snow as Thomas Wade crouched beside the dying embers of his campfire. At 19, he had the weathered hands of a man twice his age and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. The mountains of Colorado Territory stretched endlessly around him, their peaks already crowned with white. Warning of the harsh winter ahead, he had been wandering these mountains for 3 years now, ever since the fever took his parents and left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of grief. The small mining town where he'd grown up had no use for an orphan boy with no trade and no family to vouch for him. So he'd taken to the wilderness, living off whatever he could hunt or forage, sleeping under stars that offered no warmth but at least didn't judge. The sound of rushing water nearby reminded him he'd need to refill his water pouch before moving. Winter was coming fast, and he needed to find shelter in the lower valleys before the snows made travel impossible. As he stood and shouldered his meager pack, a sound froze him in place. The desperate cry of someone in distress carried. On the wind from somewhere near the river, Thomas hesitated. In his 3 years alone, he'd learned that trouble often wore a human face, and kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and something in his chest tightened. He'd lost his own family, watched them slip away while he stood helpless. He couldn't walk away from someone else's suffering. Following the sound, pushed through a thicket of aspens, their golden leaves whispering warnings in the breeze. At the river's edge, he found her, a young native woman, perhaps his own age, collapsed on the rocky shore. Her long black hair was matted with blood from a gash on her forehead, and her deerskin dress was torn and muddy. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Thomas dropped to his knees beside her, his heart hammering. He'd seen death before, knew its approach intimately. This girl was close to joining the spirits her people honored. Without thinking, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, delicate as a bird. But he could feel the strength in her small frame. His shelter was crude little more than a Leonta he'd built. Against a large boulder, but it would protect her from the wind. He laid her gently on his bedroll, the only soft thing he owned, and began tending to her wounds with the careful hands of someone who'd learned doctoring from necessity. As he cleaned the blood from her face, she stirred, her eyelids fluttering. When they opened fully, Thomas found himself staring into eyes the color of deep forest pools, flecked with gold-like sunlight through leaves. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in that strange space between strangers and something more. "Safe," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "I won't hurt you." She studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Most people look through him these days, as if his poverty made him invisible. But this girl saw him, really saw him, and something in her gaze made his chest ache with a longing he'd buried years ago. "You were alone," she said finally, her English accented, but clear. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, suddenly ashamed. Of his rough appearance, his patched clothes, the hollow look he knew lived in his eyes. "Yes. Are you?" "Now I am." Pain flickered across her features, and she tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured head. Said, steadying her with gentle hands, "You've been hurt." What happened? Her story came out in fragments. Her name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her people's tongue. She was the daughter of a respected medicine woman from a small band that wintered in the valleys below. 3 days ago, white prospectors had come to their camp demanding to know about gold in the streams, and her people had tried to explain that the mountains were sacred, that disturbing them would bring misfortune. The men had grown violent. "They killed my mother," she whispered, and Thomas saw tears glisten in her eyes. "My father, too. I ran, but they followed. I fell from my horse at the river crossing, hit my head on the rocks, looked up at him with those devastating eyes. I was ready to join the spirits. Why did you save me?" Question hung between them like morning mist. Thomas had no answer that made sense, even to himself. He'd stopped believing in goodness, in purpose, in anything beyond simple survival. But something about her had called to him, demanded he act against his own careful nature. "I couldn't let you die alone," he said finally. The words seemed to unlock something in both of them. Over the next 3 days, as Ayana recovered her strength, they shared the kind of deep, honest conversation that comes only between people who have nothing left to lose. She told him about her childhood, learning the healing ways from her mother, gathering plants in high meadows while her father taught her the old stories. He spoke of his parents, the small house where love had lived before disease stole it away, the crushing loneliness that had become his constant companion. On the 4th morning, Ayana announced she was strong enough to travel. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "To my grandmother's people, 3 days south across the high passes. They will take me in." She paused, studying his face. "You could come with me." The offer hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine it belonging somewhere again, being welcomed, maybe even being loved. But reality crashed down like an avalanche. "Your people won't want me there," he said. "I'm nobody. I have nothing to offer." Offered me my life? That was different. Ayana stepped closer, and he caught the scent of sage and something uniquely her. "My grandmother reads the signs in all things. She'll see what I see in you." "What do you see?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Her hand touched his cheek, gentle as morning dew. A good heart that has forgotten how to hope. Strong spirit wounded by loss. A man who saved a stranger's life because his soul still believes in light, even when his mind has accepted darkness. Thomas closed his eyes, overwhelmed by her touch, her words, the impossible possibility she offered. When he opened them again, she was watching him with something that looked dangerously like love. "I can't," he whispered. "I won't bring shame to you among your people." Something shifted in her expression, a hardening that made his chest tighten. "Then help me cross the passes safely. After that, if you choose to leave, I will not stop you." Journey took 5 days instead of 3. The early winter storms had already begun. They had to pick their way carefully through treacherous terrain, taking shelter when the wind grew too fierce. Thomas found himself watching Ayana constantly, memorizing the graceful way she moved through difficult ground. The sound of her laughter when she caught him studying her. The way firelight played across her features when they huddled together. For warmth, each night they slept close together for survival, and each night the space between them seemed to shrink. On the 3rd night, as snow fell steadily outside their improvised shelter, Ayana turned in his arms and looked up at him, with eyes that held no uncertainty. "I know you plan to leave me," she said quietly. "Ayana, but before you do, I want you to know something." Her hand found his chest, resting over his heart. "In my mother's language, there is a word tokoda. It means friend to all. But there is another meaning, older and deeper. It speaks of 2 spirits that recognize each other across time and space, that are bound by something stronger than blood or tribe or circumstance." Thomas felt his resolve crumbling like a riverbank in flood. "You don't know me?" "Not really." "I'm broken, Ayana. I have nothing." She silenced him with a kiss that tasted of promises and hope and everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. When they broke apart, her eyes were fierce. "What? You have yourself," she whispered. "That is everything." They made love. That night, with the tenderness of people who had found each other against impossible odds, but even as Thomas held her close, feeling more complete than he had in years, he knew it couldn't last. When morning came, reality would return, and with it all the reasons why a homeless white boy and a native girl from different worlds could never truly be together. On the final day of their journey, they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising. From the valley below, Kayana's grandmother's village spread along a protected creek, tipis and log structures arranged in careful harmony with the landscape. People moved between the buildings, tending to the daily business of survival, preparing for winter. "They will welcome you," Ayana said. But Thomas heard the uncertainty in her voice now. In the abstract, her offer had seemed possible. Faced with the reality of approaching a community where he would be the outsider, the interloper, he felt his old fears resurface. "I should go," he said quietly. Pain flashed across her features. "Thomas, please look at me," Ayana Really look." He gestured to his patched clothes, his thin frame, the gauntness that 3 years of hardship had carved into his features. "I'm a beggar. What do I bring to your people except another mouth to feed? Another burden in a hard winter?" "You bring yourself," she repeated, but her voice was smaller now. "That isn't enough." They stood there on the ridge, the village spread. Below them, like a promise he was too afraid to claim. Finally, Ayanna nodded, though tears streaked her cheeks. "If this is your choice, I will honor it," she said. "But no, this you carry my heart with you, wherever you go." The goodbye was brutal in its brevity. Thomas watched her walk down the slope toward home, her figure growing smaller with each step until she disappeared among the buildings. Only then did he allow himself to collapse, the sobs he'd held back for 3 years finally breaking free. He wandered for months after that. But the mountains felt different now. Where once they had been refuge, now they were prison. Every sunset reminded him of the gold flecks in Ayanna's eyes. Every stream brought back memories of her laughter. He existed rather than lived, going through the motions of survival while his heart remained in that valley he'd been to, afraid to enter. Spring found him thinner and more hollow-eyed than ever, camped beside a creek 2 days' walk from Ayanna's village. He told himself he wasn't staying close deliberately, that it was merely chance that had led him to winter in these particular mountains. But when he dreamed, it was always of dark hair and gentle hands, and the word Dakota whispered, like a prayer. On a morning when the aspens were just beginning to bud, he heard horses approaching. Years of solitary living had sharpened his senses, and he knew immediately that these weren't random travelers. The hoofbeats were too purposeful, too coordinated. Someone was looking for him. Thomas grabbed his rifle and found cover behind a fallen log, his heart hammering with familiar fear. Prospectors, perhaps, or settlers, who decided the mountains would be better off without drifters like him. He'd learned to expect the worst from people. But when the riders crested the rise above his camp, his breath caught in his throat. 30 mounted warriors, their faces painted for ceremony, formed a semicircle around his meager shelter. They sat their horses with the easy grace of men born to the saddle, weapons visible, but not immediately threatening. At their head rode an older man. His presence seemed to fill the entire valley. His hair was streaked with silver, his face weathered by decades of mountain weather, but his eyes held the same deep intelligence Thomas recognized from another face, another time. "Thomas Wade," the man said, his English formal and precise. "I am Chayton, grandfather to Ayanna. We have come to speak with you." Terror and hope warred in Thomas's chest. He stepped out from behind the log, still holding his rifle, but letting it point toward the ground. "If you've come for revenge, we have come because a young woman cries herself to sleep each night, calling the name of a foolish boy who believes he has nothing to offer." Chayton's voice carried the weight of authority, but also something. "That might have been kindness. She tells us, you saved her life. Anyone would have done the same, would they?" Chayton gestured to the warriors behind him. "These are hunters, Thomas Wade. They know the mountains as well as any man alive. For 6 months, they have searched for signs of the white prospectors who killed my daughter and her husband. Do you know what they found?" Thomas shook his head, confused by the turn in conversation. "Nothing, no trace, no trail, no sign that they ever existed. It is as if the mountains themselves swallowed them." Chayton's eyes never left Thomas's face. "They did find something else. Stories told by traders and trappers. Stories of a young white man who lives alone in the high country, who has never bothered anyone, never stolen, never threatened. A man who helped a lost child find his way home last winter, who shared his food with an old trapper when blizzards trapped them both in the same cave. I don't understand. You do not see yourself clearly, Thomas Wade. But others do. My granddaughter does." Chayton dismounted, his movements deliberate and ceremonial.
"Oh."
"She has asked me to extend an invitation that should have been given months ago, when pride and fear did not cloud the judgment of both sides." The old man reached into a parfleche bag and withdrew an object that made Thomas's knees nearly buckle. It was a shirt knot, the rough homespun he was used to. but beautifully crafted deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns that seemed to catch and hold the morning light. "This was made by my granddaughter's hands," Chaitan said, holding it out, every bead placed with thoughts of you. Every stitch sewn with hope that someday you would be wise enough to claim what the spirits have offered. Thomas stared at the shirt, overwhelmed by its beauty, its obvious value, the love that had gone into its creation. "I can't accept this. I haven't earned you saved her life." It was nothing. It was everything. The words rang across the valley like a gunshot. Chaitan stepped closer, his eyes blazing with emotion. "Do you think love comes only to those who have gold in their pockets? Do you think worth is measured by the size of a man's house or the number of his cattle?" "Your people will never accept me, my people," Chaitan said quietly. "Judge a man by his actions, not his possessions. They have heard how you cared for Ayana when she was hurt, how you protected her on the journey, asked for nothing in return, and walked away rather than burden her with your presence." His voice softened. "That is the behavior of a man worthy of respect, of love." Thomas felt tears threatening, the careful walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. "I'm nobody. I've nothing to offer her. You have everything she wants," Chaitan said simply. "Your heart, your loyalty, your strength. These are gifts beyond price." He held out the shirt again. "Will you come home, Thomas Wade? Will you let yourself be loved?" The moment stretched between them like a bridge spanning years of loneliness and fear. Thomas looked at the warriors watching him, their faces impassive but not unkind. He thought of Ayana, alone in the valley below, waiting for an answer he'd been too afraid to give. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached for the shirt. The ride to the village passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Thomas wore the shirt Ayana had made, and it fit as if it had been crafted specifically for his frame, which he realized it had been. The beadwork told a story, Chaitan explained as they rode. The blue represented the sky under which they'd first met. The white stood for the snow that had brought them together. The red spoke of the love that had grown between them, strong as blood, enduring as the mountains themselves. "She dreamed of you," Chaitan said as they descended toward the village. "For 3 nights after you left, she dreamed the same dream. You, standing alone on a mountain peak, calling her name. The spirits were clear in their message. Your paths are intertwined. Fighting that truth brings only pain." As they crested the final ridge, Thomas saw her. Ayana stood outside a large tipi at the village's heart, her back straight, her long hair braided with flowers. She wore a dress of white deerskin that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. And around her neck was a necklace of silver, a turquoise that caught the light like captured stars. But it was her face that stopped his heart. She'd grown more beautiful in the months they'd been apart, if such a thing were possible. But more than that, she looked complete in a way she hadn't when he'd first found her by the river.
Ow.
This was Ayana in her proper place, surrounded by her people, secure in her identity and purpose. For a moment, doubt crashed over him again. What right did he have to disrupt this perfect picture? What could he possibly offer someone so radiant, so obviously beloved by her community? As if sensing his thoughts, Ayana looked up, and their eyes met across the distance. The smile that spread across her face was like sunrise after the longest night, full of joy and relief and a love so pure it took his breath away. She ran to him then, and Thomas dismounted quickly to catch her as she threw herself into his arms. They held each other fiercely, neither speaking, both trying to make up for months of separation in a single embrace. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. "I never should have left." "You came back," she repeated, as if the words were a prayer answered. The village welcomed him with a feast that lasted 3 days. Thomas had expected suspicion, even hostility, but instead found acceptance that went beyond his wildest hopes. Ayana's grandmother, a tiny woman with eyes like chips of obsidian, proclaimed him Dakota, the friend to all, the soulmate her granddaughter had been waiting for. "The spirits spoke of you long before you appeared," she told him on the second night, as they sat around a fire while drummers played and children danced. "My daughter Yana's mother saw you in a vision when Yana was just a child. young man with golden hair and sad eyes who would save her daughter's life and steal her heart. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the weight of destiny, of purpose. He'd never believed himself capable of fulfilling. What if I fail her? What if I'm not strong enough, good enough? The old woman's laughter was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Love is not about being perfect, young one. It is about being present. It's about choosing each day to build something beautiful together. On the fourth day, they were married in a ceremony that blended traditions from both their peoples. Thomas had no family to speak for him, but Chatan stood as his father. While the village elders offered blessings for their union, Ayana had woven wildflowers into her hair, and her dress was decorated with symbols representing new beginnings, eternal love, and the joining of two paths into one. As they spoke their vows under a sky painted with sunset colors, Thomas felt something he'd thought lost forever: hope, not just for happiness, but for a future filled with purpose and love, and the kind of belonging he'd dreamed of as a lonely child. "You are my heart," Ayana said, her hands in his, as they stood before their people. "In this life and all the lives to come, you are my heart." "And you are my home," Thomas replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "The place where my soul can finally rest." The feast that followed their ceremony lasted until dawn, filled with laughter and music and stories that welcomed Thomas into the fabric of the community. He was no longer the homeless boy who'd wandered the mountains alone. He was husband, son-in-law, brother to warriors who had ridden 30 strong to bring him home. But it was later, in the quiet of their wedding lodge, that the deepest healing began. As Ayana lay in his arms, her head on his chest, she traced the scars that marked his hands and forearms, testament to 3 years of hard living. "Tell me about this one," she said, touching a long mark across his knuckles.
Got it.
"Got it on a sharp rock, trying to catch fish barehanded during the hungry time last winter." "And this?" Her finger found another scar, this one across his forearm. "Brambles, when I was gathering berries. Didn't see the thorns until too late." She kissed each scar as he named it, her touch gentle as healing rain.
Oh.
"These are not marks of shame," she said. "They are proof of your strength. Evidence that you survived when others might have given up."
Ow.
Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. For so long he'd seen his scars as signs of failure, reminders of how far he'd fallen from the life he'd once known. But under Ayana's loving touch, they became something else, badges of courage. Proof that he'd endured the worst and come through it still able to love. "I was so afraid," he admitted, "of not being enough for you, of your people seeing me as just another white drifter looking for a handout." And now, he considered the question, thinking of the welcome he'd received. The warmth in strangers' eyes as they'd shared their food and stories with him. "I think maybe the spirits knew what they were doing when they brought us together." Ayana smiled against his skin. "The spirits always know. We just don't always listen." They built a life together that was richer than anything Thomas had dared to imagine. Learned the old ways from Ayana's grandmother, studying the properties of plants and the art of healing. His careful hands, once used only for survival, found new purpose in mixing medicines and tending the sick. Ayana taught him her language. He taught her to read the English he'd learned from his mother's few precious books. In the evenings, they would sit by their fire, her head on his shoulder, as he read aloud from volumes of poetry and philosophy, translating the concepts into her tongue and marveling at how universal truths transcended cultural boundaries. When their first child was born, a son, with Thomas's golden hair and Ayana's dark eyes, the old grandmother proclaimed him a bridge between worlds, destined to help heal the growing divisions between their peoples. More children followed, daughters and sons who grew up bilingual and bicultural, quittily at home in both worlds. But it was 5 years after their wedding, when a drought threatened the valley's water supply, that Thomas truly proved his worth to the community. His years of survival in the high country had taught him to read the land's subtle signs, to find water where others saw only dry rock. "There," he said, pointing to a spot on the mountainside where most would see nothing unusual. "The aspens are greener there, and see how the grass grows differently. There's water underground." The well he helped them dig saved the village that summer, and with it, Thomas's place among his adopted people was sealed forever. He was no longer the white man who'd married Ayanna. He was Thomas Wade, water finder, healer, honored member. Of the tribe, years passed like seasons, each one layering new memories, new joys, new bonds that made Thomas's early loneliness seem like something that had happened to another person. When Shaitan grew old and his time came to join the spirits, it was Thomas who helped carry his body to the sacred burial ground. Thomas who stood with the other sons to honor a man who'd given him far more than acceptance. He'd given him a father's love. On the night of Chaitan's funeral, as Thomas sat alone on the ridge where 30 warriors had once come to fetch him home, Ayanna found him there. "Are you sad?" she asked, settling beside him under stars that painted the world in silver light. "Yes," Thomas said honestly, "but also grateful. Saved me, Ayanna, just by bringing me to you, but by showing me what it means to be a man worthy of respect." "You were always worthy," she said softly. "You just couldn't see it." In comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, until Ayanna spoke again. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me by the river that day?" Thomas considered the question. "I think I would have died up there, alone and forgotten. Not immediately, but slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of who I used to be. And I would have joined the spirits that day, never knowing the love we've shared." She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Strange how close we came to missing each other entirely." "Maybe it wasn't chance," Thomas said. "Maybe your grandmother was right about the spirits having a plan." Maybe Ayanna agreed. "Or maybe love is just powerful enough to overcome even the longest odds." As they walked back to their home, Thomas thought about the boy he'd been when he first found her. Broken, hopeless, convinced he had nothing to offer the world. That boy couldn't have imagined the life he now lived, surrounded by children's laughter and community warmth and the steady love of a woman who'd seen past his poverty to the man he could become. 30 warriors had stood at his door once, come to bring him home. But the real miracle wasn't their arrival, it was that he'd finally been ready to walk through the door they'd opened for him. Love, he'd learned, wasn't about deserving or earning or being worthy. It was about recognition, about two souls finding each other across impossible distances and choosing again and again to build something beautiful together. In the end, that was enough. That was everything. The homeless boy who'd once wandered the mountains alone was gone forever. In his place stood a man who'd learned the most important truth of all. Sometimes salvation comes not from what we achieve, but from what we allow ourselves to receive. Under the endless western sky, with his wife's hand in his, and his children's, future stretching bright before them, Thomas Wade had finally found his way home.